The room went silent the moment power changed hands, even though nobody in it realized it yet. At exactly 7:42 p.m. inside the Whitmore Foundation Gala in downtown Manhattan, laughter, champagne glasses, and soft piano music filled a ballroom designed for influence, not consequences, until a single moment fractured the illusion of control. Danielle Carter stood near the center of the stage in a simple black evening dress, her presence understated, almost invisible to those who had already decided who she was supposed to be, while Brandon Whitmore, heir to the Whitmore family empire, stepped forward with a smile that carried more arrogance than confidence. "People like you don't belong at tables like this," he said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. And before anyone could interpret the meaning behind his words, he made a dismissive, humiliating gesture in her direction that pulled a wave of uncomfortable silence across the front rows. Some guests shifted in their seats, others pretended not to notice, and a few lifted their phones just slightly higher, sensing something they would later replay in disbelief. Danielle didn't step back, didn't react the way they expected, didn't give them the satisfaction of emotion. She simply held her gaze steady on him, as if she was observing something far less significant than he believed himself to be. Across the ballroom, Victoria Whitmore leaned toward security with a tight expression and whispered instructions that didn't need to be loud to carry authority, while Richard Whitmore, seated at the head table, frowned as though inconvenience itself had entered his carefully controlled evening. "Remove her before this turns into a spectacle," he said under his breath, convinced that control was still his to exercise. But somewhere beyond their perception, the system that defined their power structure was already reacting in silence. A junior event coordinator near the side entrance paused mid-step, glancing at a tablet screen that flickered unexpectedly, registering a name she recognized but couldn't immediately place in context. Danielle Carter. The name repeated itself in her mind like a warning she had missed earlier. Meanwhile, Danielle finally turned slightly, not toward the Whitmores, but toward the stage projection behind her, where sponsor names and funding acknowledgments rotated slowly in gold lettering, as if the room itself was unaware of its own vulnerability. She reached into her clutch and sent a single message without breaking eye contact with anyone in particular. No urgency in her movement, no visible tension, only precision. Somewhere miles away, inside a secure financial operations center, an alert quietly activated. Back in the ballroom, guests continued smiling, unaware that the foundation of the evening had already begun to shift. Danielle's voice finally broke through the atmosphere, calm and measured, carrying without effort across the polished floor. "You assumed this was your space," she said, not raising her tone, not seeking validation, "but you never checked who built it." The sentence didn't land as drama, it landed as recognition, like something had always been true but had never been spoken out loud. A few guests stopped breathing for half a second, unsure why the air felt heavier. Brandon Whitmore forced a laugh, trying to reclaim the moment, but it didn't carry the same certainty it had before. The pianist hesitated mid-note, sensing the shift even if he didn't understand it. And in that quiet pause stretching across the ballroom, Danielle Carter remained exactly where she had been standing from the beginning, as if she had never needed to move at all, because the outcome was already in motion long before anyone else decided to pay attention. The moment her words settled into the air, the atmosphere inside the ballroom changed in ways that were not immediately visible, but deeply felt by everyone present, as if the room itself had begun to reconsider what it had assumed about the woman standing so calmly near the center of the stage. The Whitmore family's confidence, once effortless and practiced, began to fracture at the edges of their expressions, not through panic, but through the subtle discomfort of people realizing they might not fully understand the situation they believed they controlled. Victoria Whitmore straightened her posture and gave a quiet signal to the event staff near the side wall, expecting the environment to return to order, yet the response she anticipated did not come with the same immediacy she was used to. Instead, a junior coordinator paused mid-step, staring at her tablet with a growing sense of uncertainty as the system refreshed itself without instruction, revealing a name that seemed out of place only because it had never been associated with anything small. Danielle Carter appeared again across the internal event interface, this time marked not as a guest, but as a primary financial contributor tied to multiple foundational sponsorship layers that supported the entire gala. The coordinator hesitated, her eyes moving between the screen and the stage, as though trying to reconcile two versions of reality that refused to align. At the same moment, the projection wall behind the stage, which had been displaying elegant sponsor acknowledgments, flickered briefly before stabilizing into a revised sequence that subtly repositioned key financial contributors, placing Danielle Carter's name closer to the top tier of influence than anyone in the Whitmore family line. A soft murmur began to ripple through nearby tables as guests noticed the change, not fully understanding what had shifted, but sensing that something important had been reordered without announcement. Brandon Whitmore, still standing near the front of the stage, followed the direction of several guests' gazes and frowned slightly as he noticed the updated display, his confidence tightening into something less certain, less performative. Richard Whitmore leaned forward, whispering sharply to an assistant seated beside him, but the assistant only shook his head once, unable to provide clarity fast enough to restore control. Danielle remained still, her expression unchanged, not reacting to the visual confirmation unfolding around her, as if none of it was new information to her at all. Somewhere beyond the ballroom, in a secured corporate coordination channel, a quiet alert had already been logged, confirming authorization alignment across multiple financial layers tied to the event's funding structure. No alarms sounded, no disruptions occurred, only a silent recalibration of access and acknowledgement that continued to propagate through systems designed to appear invisible until they were needed. Back in the room, guests who had moments ago been focused on entertainment now found themselves subtly recalculating what they were witnessing, their attention shifting from the spectacle of the gala to the implications of the names being displayed above it. One of the senior planners, standing near the side entrance, lowered her tablet slightly and whispered to herself as recognition finally connected the missing context. The funding architecture behind the entire evening was not merely supported by external sponsors, but anchored by a controlling interest that had never been publicly emphasized. Her eyes lifted toward Danielle, now with a different kind of understanding forming quietly behind them. Brandon attempted to regain conversational control, speaking to a nearby guest in a tone meant to dismiss the earlier tension, but even his words lacked the ease they had carried before. The room no longer responded to him in the same way. It was not defiance, not confrontation, but a subtle redistribution of attention that left him slightly displaced from the center of influence. Danielle finally shifted her gaze toward the projection screen again, watching her name settle into its revised position, then turned her attention back to the Whitmore family with the same calm composure she had maintained since arriving. The silence that followed was no longer empty. It was weighted, as though the room itself was waiting to understand what would happen next, now that the foundation beneath the evening had begun to reveal its true structure. The shift in the room was no longer subtle. It was becoming structural, as if the very social order that had guided every interaction inside the ballroom was quietly rewriting itself in real time without asking for permission. Danielle Carter remained still near the stage, her posture unchanged, but the space around her no longer treated her as an outsider. Instead, it began to respond to her presence with a delayed recognition that made every previous assumption feel unstable. Across the Whitmore table, Richard Whitmore adjusted his cufflinks and leaned toward his advisors, speaking in low, urgent tones that no longer carried the same authority they once did, because the information they were receiving in real time was not aligning with the narrative they had constructed about the evening. The projection wall behind the stage refreshed again, this time revealing a structured breakdown of financial contributions tied to the gala, and as the list expanded, guests began to notice a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Multiple tiers of funding traced back to a single consolidated authority node, and that node carried Danielle Carter's name in a position that indicated not participation, but oversight. A ripple of quiet confusion moved through the audience as individuals began to realize they had not simply attended an event, they had entered a system they had not fully understood. Brandon Whitmore, who had been standing with forced confidence, now found his attention divided between the projection screen and Danielle herself. His earlier certainty replaced by a slow tightening uncertainty that he tried to mask with shallow laughter directed at a nearby guest who no longer seemed receptive to his tone. Victoria Whitmore, noticing the change in atmosphere, attempted to reassert social control by engaging directly with the event coordinator team, but the responses she received were hesitant, fragmented, and increasingly delayed, as if internal validation systems were no longer prioritizing her authority in the way they once had. At the edge of the ballroom, a senior financial liaison quietly checked her secure device and froze for a brief moment when confirmation data aligned across multiple independent verification channels, all pointing back to the same structural reality, that the Gala's financial foundation was not merely influenced by external investors, but anchored by a controlling entity whose identity had not been emphasized in any of the public introductions. She lowered the device slightly, her expression shifting from professional composure to careful reassessment, and for the first time she looked toward Danielle not as a guest, but as the origin point of the entire framework they were standing inside. Meanwhile, Danielle finally took a slow step forward, not toward the Whitmore family, but toward the center of the stage where visibility was highest, her movement calm and deliberate, as though she was simply aligning herself with a position she had always been entitled to occupy. The room followed her movement unconsciously, heads turning without instruction, conversations fading without conclusion, and even the staff near the edges of the ballroom paused in place as the focus of attention recentered itself around her. Brandon attempted once more to speak, but his voice did not carry the same influence it had earlier in the evening, dissolving slightly before it reached the surrounding guests. Danielle's gaze lifted toward the projection screen one final time, observing the stabilized hierarchy now displayed across the Gala's financial structure, and then she turned her attention back to the Whitmore family with an expression that carried neither urgency nor emotion, only clarity. The silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was anticipatory, as if the entire room had begun to understand that whatever would happen next was no longer dependent on permission, but on realization. The atmosphere inside the ballroom had reached a point where silence was no longer emptiness, but a form of pressure that pressed evenly against every surface, every conversation, and every individual who had entered the space believing they understood how control worked. Danielle Carter stood at the center of that silence, her presence steady, unshaken, as though the shifting reactions around her were not disruptions, but confirmations of something already decided long before the evening began. The projection screen behind the stage refreshed again, and this time the financial architecture of the gala was displayed with even greater clarity, revealing not just tiers of sponsorship, but interconnected control pathways that extended beyond the event itself into broader institutional structures tied to the Whitmore family enterprise. Guests who had initially glanced at the screen out of curiosity now stared longer, their expressions tightening as they began to recognize that what they were seeing was not decorative acknowledgement, but a live financial map that placed influence in unexpected hands. Richard Whitmore's posture stiffened as he read the updated structure, his eyes moving faster than his words could form, while Victoria Whitmore quietly instructed a staff member to retrieve internal confirmation from the back-end system, her tone controlled but noticeably less certain than before. The staff member hesitated for a moment before complying, and in that brief hesitation something subtle shifted, as if the chain of unquestioned authority had developed its first visible fracture. Brandon Whitmore attempted to regain momentum by speaking to the nearest table with forced humor, but the guests no longer responded with ease, their attention divided between him and the evolving display behind the stage that continued to reorganize itself into a hierarchy that no longer favored the narrative they had assumed. A senior financial advisor near the side of the ballroom opened a secured communication channel and paused when the verification results returned not as alerts or warnings, but as confirmations of structural override permissions linked directly to Danielle Carter's financial authority portfolio. She lowered her device slowly, her expression changing from professional detachment to careful reassessment, and for the first time, she looked at Danielle with recognition that carried weight beyond social status. Meanwhile, Danielle finally turned slightly toward the Whitmore family table, her movement measured, not rushed, as though she was acknowledging a conversation that had already been underway long before anyone else had realized it. The air around her seemed to narrow and focus, drawing attention without effort, and even the guests seated furthest from the stage found themselves shifting their gaze toward her without conscious decision. Brandon Whitmore tried once more to assert presence, speaking as if volume could restore structure, but his words now felt separated from the environment, no longer anchored to the collective attention of the room. Danielle did not respond immediately. Instead, she observed the projection screen as it stabilized into its final configuration, then returned her attention to the Whitmore family with a calm that did not require escalation to be understood. The realization spreading through the ballroom was no longer speculative. It was observational, as guests quietly connected the alignment of financial control, structural authority, and the identity of the woman they had initially treated as incidental. Even the staff stationed near the exits stood still, no longer moving with procedural urgency, as if awaiting instructions that no longer originated from where they expected. The silence that followed was no longer fragile. It was absolute, carrying the sense that whatever would unfold next was not a reaction, but an outcome already in motion. The silence that had settled across the ballroom was no longer passive. It had become a form of recognition, as though the entire space had finally synchronized its understanding of what had been present all along but never properly acknowledged. Danielle Carter remained composed at the center of the stage, her stillness no longer interpreted as distance or detachment, but as certainty that required no reinforcement. Behind her, the projection system shifted once more, not with dramatic interruption, but with quiet precision, refining the financial hierarchy displayed across the Gala structure into a final configuration that removed ambiguity entirely. The Whitmore family name, once positioned as the dominant presence of the evening, now appeared redistributed across a broader network of oversight, with clear indicators showing dependency on a higher consolidated authority. Richard Whitmore's expression tightened as he reviewed the updated information through his personal device, his earlier confidence replaced by a measured stillness that suggested calculation rather than denial. Victoria Whitmore, standing slightly behind him, maintained her composure but no longer issued directives, instead observing the responses of those around her as if reassessing the stability of the environment itself. Across the ballroom, guests who had moments earlier been passive observers were now fully engaged in silent interpretation, their attention moving between the projection screen and Danielle, with increasing awareness that the relationship between visibility and power had been fundamentally misunderstood. A senior operations consultant near the side wall lowered her communication device and confirmed internally that the structural authority markers associated with the Gala's funding ecosystem had been updated in real time, reflecting not a change in circumstance, but a correction of previously unacknowledged alignment. She did not speak immediately, but her posture shifted, and in that subtle adjustment others nearby began to mirror her understanding without needing explanation. Brandon Whitmore attempted once again to stabilize perception through presence, stepping forward slightly and addressing the nearest cluster of guests with controlled remarks designed to restore normality, but the response he received lacked reinforcement. Conversations did not resume with previous ease, and even polite acknowledgement felt delayed, as though the room itself required additional processing time before accepting his framing. Danielle finally moved forward one step, not dramatically, but with enough intention that the nearest guests instinctively created space without instruction. Her gaze moved across the room, not searching, but confirming, and when she spoke, her voice carried evenly without amplification. There was no urgency in her tone, no attempt to persuade, only a clarity that settled across the audience in layers. The projection screen behind her stabilized into its final structure, and in that moment the ballroom no longer felt like an event space, but like a system revealing its own architecture in real time. Richard Whitmore looked up from his device and then toward Danielle, his expression now fully aligned with the understanding that the situation was no longer evolving in their favor, not through conflict, but through irreversible recognition of structure. The guests remained still, not out of confusion, but out of the realization that their role had shifted from observers to witnesses of a hierarchy they had not been positioned to see from the beginning. Danielle did not raise her voice again, because there was no need to reinforce what the room had already begun to understand, and in that quiet certainty, the evening reached a point where nothing further needed to be said for the outcome to already feel complete. The atmosphere inside the ballroom had settled into a rare form of stillness where even the smallest movement felt amplified, as though the entire space had become sensitive to intention rather than action. Danielle Carter stood at the center of that stillness, no longer perceived as a guest among many, but as the fixed point around which the evening's structure had quietly reorganized itself. The projection system behind the stage stabilized into its final configuration, now displaying a consolidated financial framework that extended beyond the gala itself, revealing a layered network of oversight and authorization that had previously been distributed in ways that obscured its true center. Guests who had once observed casually were now fully focused, their attention no longer driven by curiosity, but by the recognition that they were witnessing the exposure of a structure they had never been shown in full. Richard Whitmore stood rigidly near the front table, his earlier attempts at composure replaced by silent evaluation, his eyes moving between the projection and Danielle, with a growing awareness that the narrative he had relied upon was no longer functional within this environment. Victoria Whitmore remained upright, her posture controlled, but her gaze had shifted from command to analysis, as though recalculating every interaction that had taken place since Danielle's arrival. Across the ballroom, the junior coordinator who had first noticed the system change earlier now confirmed internally that multiple financial verification channels were synchronizing in real time, each one aligning independently with the same structural conclusion that placed Danielle Carter not within the hierarchy, but above it. She lowered her device slightly, her expression now reflecting understanding rather than uncertainty, and around her, subtle reactions began to ripple outward as others quietly registered the implications of what was being confirmed. Brandon Whitmore attempted to step forward once more, but his movement lacked the confidence it had carried earlier, as if the environment itself no longer responded to his attempt to reclaim influence. His voice, when it came, did not travel with the same authority, dispersing into the room before it could settle into impact. Danielle finally turned her attention fully toward the Whitmore family, her expression unchanged, carrying a calm that did not require reinforcement or reaction to maintain its presence. The silence that followed was no longer shaped by surprise, but by comprehension, as guests began to understand that the structure governing the evening had not shifted suddenly, but had simply revealed what had always been in place. The projection behind her completed its final update cycle, locking into a stable framework that no longer changed, as if confirming that all necessary information had already been disclosed. Richard Whitmore lowered his gaze briefly, then looked back up, no longer attempting to challenge what he saw, but instead processing the full scope of its meaning. Around the room, conversations had ceased entirely, replaced by focused observation, as if every individual present understood that speaking would no longer influence outcome. Danielle took one final measured breath, her presence steady and grounded, and in that moment the ballroom reached a level of clarity where no additional action was required for understanding to be complete. The moment of full recognition did not arrive with noise or interruption, but with a gradual and irreversible settling of understanding that moved across the ballroom like a silent wave, touching every guest, every staff member, and every member of the Whitmore family in a different, but equally undeniable way. Danielle Carter remained at the center of that stillness, her presence unchanged, yet now perceived through a completely different lens, as if the room had finally aligned its perception with reality rather than assumption. The projection system behind the stage held its final configuration, no longer shifting or recalculating, displaying a stable financial structure that clearly indicated the evening was not simply hosted under multiple sponsors, but governed by a consolidated authority that extended far beyond the gala itself. Richard Whitmore stood motionless near the front table, his earlier attempts to regain conversational control now absent, replaced by a measured silence that suggested internal confirmation rather than resistance. Victoria Whitmore, still composed in appearance, subtly shifted her gaze between the screen and Danielle, her posture reflecting a recalibration of everything she had assumed about the boundaries of influence within the room. Across the ballroom, guests who had previously observed in uncertainty now stood in quiet awareness, their attention fixed not on spectacle, but on implication, as they began to understand that the structure they were witnessing had always existed beneath the surface of what they had been shown. The junior coordinator near the side entrance lowered her device completely, no longer needing verification, as the synchronized confirmation across internal systems had already stabilized into a single consistent conclusion that placed Danielle Carter at the highest operational tier of authority connected to the event. Around her, others followed the same realization without discussion, as if collective understanding had replaced the need for explanation. Brandon Whitmore took a small step forward, but it was no longer a step that carried momentum, rather a gesture that revealed uncertainty, as his voice when he attempted to speak did not hold the same resonance it had earlier, dissolving slightly into the atmosphere rather than commanding it. Danielle turned her attention fully toward the Whitmore family, her expression calm and steady, carrying no urgency, because nothing about the situation required acceleration. The silence that filled the ballroom was now complete, not because something had been taken away, but because everything necessary for understanding had already been revealed. The projection behind her remained unchanged, reinforcing the finality of the structure it displayed. While guests continued to process the shift not as an event unfolding in real time, but as the confirmation of something that had been true long before they became aware of it. Richard Whitmore finally lowered his gaze for a brief moment before lifting it again, no longer searching for an alternative interpretation, but instead accepting the full weight of what had been established. Around the room, no one spoke, not out of confusion, but out of recognition that speech would no longer alter the outcome. Danielle remained still, centered within the space that had now fully acknowledged her position, and in that stillness the ballroom reached a point of clarity where the distinction between perception and reality had completely dissolved. The silence inside the ballroom no longer felt like anticipation, it felt like conclusion, as if the space itself had completed the process of revealing everything it was meant to expose. Danielle Carter remained at the center of that conclusion, still and composed, while the environment around her shifted into a state of quiet resolution that no longer depended on reaction or interpretation. The projection system behind the stage stabilized into a final locked display, showing a complete financial hierarchy that confirmed not only oversight, but control pathways extending through the Gala's entire funding structure and beyond it. Guests who had once been uncertain were now fully aware that what they had witnessed was not an unfolding disruption, but a structured correction of assumed authority. Richard Whitmore stood near the front table without movement, his expression no longer attempting to project confidence, but instead reflecting a careful acceptance of the reality displayed before him. Victoria Whitmore remained upright, her composure intact, yet her eyes no longer scanned for control points, instead resting on the screen with a recognition that nothing in her previous understanding remained operationally accurate. Across the ballroom, the junior coordinator who had first noticed the system update earlier now confirmed internally that all access verification layers had synchronized into a single final state, effectively locking the Whitmore family's administrative privileges at a level that no longer allowed discretionary override within the event framework. She did not announce this realization, but her lowered gaze and still posture communicated it to those nearby, who were already beginning to understand without instruction. Brandon Whitmore took a step forward as if to speak, but the absence of response from the room made his attempt feel disconnected from the environment itself, and his voice, when it followed, lacked the authority it had carried earlier, dissolving before it could establish influence. Danielle finally shifted her attention fully across the room, her presence unchanged, but now functioning as the definitive reference point for everything the space contained. The silence was no longer uncertain. It was final, shaped by the recognition that no further escalation, clarification, or negotiation was required for the situation to be understood. The projection behind her held steady, no longer updating, as if the system itself had entered a completed state of confirmation. Guests remained still, not because they were waiting, but because they understood that waiting had already ended. Richard Whitmore lowered his gaze once more, then slowly raised it again, not seeking reversal, but acknowledging structure. Victoria Whitmore did not intervene further, as any attempt to restore previous assumptions would no longer align with the operational reality now visible across every layer of the environment. Danielle stood quietly within the center of it all, not as a disruption to the evening, but as the point at which the evening had resolved into clarity. And in that resolution, the ballroom reached a state where nothing further needed to occur for the outcome to be fully understood. The final silence did not break. It settled deeper, becoming something closer to resolution than pause, as if the ballroom itself had accepted that the sequence of events had reached its completed form. Danielle Carter remained at the center of that stillness, her posture unchanged, her presence no longer interpreted through uncertainty or speculation, but through recognition that had fully replaced doubt. The projection system behind the stage displayed its final stabilized configuration, holding the complete financial hierarchy without further fluctuation, confirming a unified structure of control that extended far beyond the gala and into the underlying framework that supported it. Guests who had once stood as observers were now fully aware that what they had experienced was not escalation, but exposure, a gradual unveiling of alignment between perception and reality that had been present all along but never acknowledged in full. Richard Whitmore stood near the front table without movement, his earlier composure now replaced by a quiet stillness that reflected acceptance rather than resistance, his gaze fixed on the display as if verifying the finality of what could no longer be reframed. Victoria Whitmore maintained her posture, but her attention no longer shifted between participants or outcomes, instead remaining anchored to the realization that the environment itself had recalibrated beyond their influence. Across the ballroom, staff members who had previously awaited instruction remained in position without further directive, as internal systems had already completed their final authorization state, leaving no operational ambiguity to resolve. The junior coordinator who had first noticed the system change earlier now stood with her device lowered completely, her understanding no longer developing, but finalized, as confirmation across all verification layers had aligned into a single irreversible structure. Brandon Whitmore no longer attempted to speak. His earlier momentum dissolved into silence that no longer responded to intent, as if the room itself no longer registered his attempts to reassert presence. Danielle finally turned her gaze across the entire ballroom, not seeking reaction, not prompting response, but simply acknowledging the completed state of the environment around her. The silence that followed was no longer tension, no longer anticipation, but closure, shaped by the full recognition that the system governing the evening had already resolved itself into finality. The projection behind her remained steady, unchanged, reinforcing the conclusion without requiring explanation or reinforcement. Richard Whitmore lowered his gaze one final time, then lifted it again, no longer interpreting, only acknowledging what had already been confirmed across every visible layer of structure and control. Victoria Whitmore did not move to intervene, as there was no remaining framework through which intervention could meaningfully operate. Guests remained still, not because they were waiting, but because the moment of waiting had already passed into understanding. Danielle stood at the center of it all,